The sun rose lazily over a small, picturesque town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, its rays bouncing off the dew-kissed rooftops. It was a quintessential American morning, families preparing breakfast, dogs barking in the yards, and children rushing out to catch the school bus. For Annie Caldwell, a 34-year-old nurse, the day seemed ordinary as she drove her rusted sedan towards St. Vincent's Hospital for her shift. Little did she know, this would be the day her life changed forever. At 9:02 a.m., the earth began to shake. The tremor was subtle at first, a low rumble that could have been mistaken for a passing train. But within seconds, it escalated into a violent convulsion that split the ground open. Annie slammed the brakes, her hands gripping the steering wheel as her car bounced like a toy. Power lines snapped overhead, sparks raining down like miniature firestorms. Buildings in the distance swayed unnaturally before collapsing into clouds of dust and debris. "Earthquake!" Someone screamed, their voice drowned out by the cacophony of destruction. Annie's survival instincts kicked in. She threw open her car door and bolted toward an open field nearby, dodging falling streetlights and chunks of concrete. She'd learned from disaster drills that open spaces were the safest during quakes. As she ran, she glanced back to see entire rows of houses reduced to rubble. A plume of smoke billowed into the sky, marking the start of a catastrophe that would leave scars for generations. But the earthquake was only the beginning. The chain reaction. Beneath the surface, miles away, a massive pipeline carrying natural gas had ruptured under the seismic pressure. Within moments, the gas ignited, sending a fiery explosion ripping through a nearby industrial zone. The force of the blast shattered windows across town, including the glass of Annie's car. She hit the ground instinctively as a deafening roar filled the air. When she looked up, her heart sank. A mushrooming fireball climbed into the sky, its heat palpable even from her position half a mile away. The flames began to spread rapidly, devouring anything in their path. Gas stations, homes, and vehicles became fodder for the inferno. Annie scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She noticed a young boy, no older than 10, standing in the middle of the road, frozen with fear. Without thinking, she ran toward him, scooping him up just as a piece of flaming debris crashed nearby. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to calm him. "Ethan," the boy stammered, clutching her arm tightly. "Ethan, we're going to find your parents," Annie promised, though deep down, she wasn't sure if they'd survive the chaos. The struggle to find safety. The hospital was no longer an option. Annie could see from a distance that it had been partially destroyed by the quake. Smoke rose from its roof, and ambulances were scattered like discarded toys in the parking lot. Instead, she decided to head toward the riverbank on the town's outskirts, hoping the water might serve as a natural barrier against the spreading fire. But the journey was far from safe. The roads were a maze of overturned cars, downed power lines, and terrified people. Annie saw families huddling together, their faces streaked with soot and tears. She wanted to stop and help them all, but Ethan's safety was her priority. As they neared the river, the ground trembled again. Another aftershock rippled through the town, causing more structures to collapse. Annie and Ethan ducked behind an abandoned truck as debris rained down around them. When the tremors subsided, she peered out cautiously, only to find their path blocked by a massive sinkhole that had swallowed an entire section of the road. "Stay close to me," she told Ethan, her voice firm but gentle. They would have to find another way. A glimpse of hope. As they navigated the chaotic streets, Annie's determination only grew stronger. Her medical training kicked in when she came across injured survivors. She tore strips from her shirt to create makeshift bandages, all while keeping Ethan close by her side. At one point, they encountered a man pinned under a fallen beam. He was conscious but in excruciating pain. Annie hesitated for a moment. Helping him could delay their escape, but leaving him felt unthinkable. "Ethan, I need you to be brave," she said, placing the boy in a safe spot nearby. Using every ounce of strength, she managed to lift the beam just enough for the man to crawl out. He thanked her profusely before limping off to find his family. "Why did you do that?" Ethan asked as they resumed their journey. "Because we don't leave people behind," she replied, her voice resolute. The fire closes in. By late afternoon, the firestorm had engulfed nearly the entire town. Ash fell from the sky like snow, coating everything in a gray haze. Breathing became difficult as the air grew thick with smoke. Annie fashioned a crude mask for Ethan using a piece of fabric, and told him to keep it pressed over his nose and mouth. When they finally reached the riverbank, Annie felt a surge of relief. The wide expanse of water stretched before them, offering a stark contrast to the fiery hellscape they had just escaped. But even here danger loomed. The river was swollen from recent rains, its current strong and unforgiving. "I can't swim," Ethan admitted, his voice barely audible over the roaring flames in the distance. Annie knelt down to his level. "You won't have to," she said. "We'll find another way." Spotting an overturned rowboat nearby, she sprang into action. Using all her strength, she managed to push it into the water. She helped Ethan climb in before jumping in herself. As they paddled away from the shore using pieces of driftwood, Annie glanced back at the town, now consumed by fire and smoke. Her heart ached for the lives lost, but she knew she couldn't dwell on the past. Survival was the only option now. The river carried them downstream, away from the immediate danger. But Annie knew their ordeal was far from over. The road to safety would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was determined to protect Ethan, and herself, at all costs. The worst disaster in the town's history had struck without warning, but Annie's courage and resilience shone as a beacon of hope amid the darkness. The river offered a brief respite from the chaos, but survival demanded more than just escape. As the boat drifted downstream, Annie remained vigilant, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of refuge. The air was still thick with ash, and every so often, a gust of wind carried the acrid scent of smoke. Ethan sat quietly, clutching the edge of the boat, his small body trembling from the cold and the sheer terror of the day. "We're going to be okay," Annie reassured him, though her own confidence wavered. The current picked up speed, sending the boat careening around bends and through debris-choked waters. Logs, branches, and pieces of broken furniture floated alongside them, remnants of lives torn apart by the disaster. Annie's hands ached from gripping the makeshift paddles, but she refused to stop. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the river in shades of orange and purple, the temperature plummeted. Annie knew they couldn't stay on the water all night. They needed shelter, warmth, and most importantly, food. The riverbank refuge. Hours later, Annie spotted a clearing on the riverbank. It wasn't much, a patch of dirt surrounded by trees, but it offered a safe place to rest. She steered the boat toward the shore and helped Ethan climb out, both of them staggering from exhaustion. The forest loomed around them, its shadows deep and foreboding. Annie's stomach churned with hunger, but the need to find warmth and safety took precedence. She gathered fallen branches and used the lighter she always carried in her pocket to start a small fire. As the flames crackled to life, Ethan sat close, his face illuminated by the soft glow. "Do you think my parents are okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Annie hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know, Ethan," she admitted, her heart aching at the boy's vulnerability. "But if they're out there, they'll be looking for you. And we'll do everything we can to find them." The fire provided some comfort, but it couldn't erase the haunting images of the day. Annie's mind raced with questions. How widespread was the disaster? Were there others like them, fighting to survive? And what dangers still lay ahead? A startling discovery. The next morning, Annie woke to the sound of rustling leaves. Her instincts kicked in immediately, and she reached for a large branch she'd sharpened into a crude weapon. Peering into the trees, she saw movement, a figure stumbling toward them. "Stay behind me," she whispered to Ethan, positioning herself between him and the approaching stranger. The figure emerged into the clearing, revealing a man in his late 40s, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm just looking for help." Annie lowered the branch but didn't let her guard down. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Name's Jack," the man replied. I was caught in the explosion at the industrial park. Barely made it out. He glanced at the boy. You two alone? Annie hesitated before nodding. Jack seemed harmless, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. I can help, he said. I know these woods. There's an old ranger station not far from here. It might have supplies. Annie weighed her options. Jack could be lying, but staying in the clearing wasn't a viable long-term plan. She decided to take the risk. The journey through the forest. The trio set off through the dense forest, the towering trees casting long shadows over their path. Jack led the way, his familiarity with the terrain evident in the confident strides he took. Annie kept Ethan close, her eyes darting to every sound and movement around them. The forest was alive with subtle dangers, uneven ground, thorny bushes, and the distant howls of animals. At one point, they came across a stream where Jack paused to drink and fill a makeshift canteen. Water's safe here, he said, motioning for Annie and Ethan to do the same. Annie knelt by the stream, cupping the cool water in her hands. It was a small comfort in an otherwise harrowing journey. As they moved deeper into the woods, the remnants of the disaster became evident. They passed charred patches of forest where the firestorm had spread, the blackened trees standing like ghostly sentinels. Once they stumbled upon a wrecked car half submerged in a ditch, its windows shattered and its doors hanging open. What happened here? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with fear. Nature and man, Jack replied grimly. Sometimes they work together to remind us who's in charge. The ranger station. By late afternoon, they arrived at the ranger station, a small wooden structure nestled in a clearing. It was worn and weathered, but it stood intact, a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Jack forced the door open, revealing a dusty interior filled with shelves of supplies. Cans of food, medical kits, and even a few blankets were among the treasures they found. Annie's heart swelled with relief as she opened a can of beans, the first real meal she and Ethan had eaten in over 24 hours. As they sat around a table, Jack pulled out a map he'd found in the station. We're here, he said, pointing to a spot on the edge of the forest. If we follow this trail, it'll take us to the highway. With any luck, rescue teams will be there. Annie nodded, her resolve strengthening. The highway represented their best chance at survival. But as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of crimson, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The disaster had tested them in ways they never imagined, and the road ahead promised more challenges. But with every step, Annie grew more determined to protect Ethan and ensure they both made it out alive. As night fell, the trio huddled together in the ranger station, the flickering firelight casting shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest whispered with unseen dangers. Inside, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. They were alive, and for now, that was enough. The early morning air was crisp as Annie, Ethan, and Jack set out from the ranger station, their supplies packed tightly into salvaged bags. Jack's map became their guide, a fragile promise of salvation that lay beyond the dense wilderness. The highway loomed as both a goal and a gamble. If rescue awaited, they would be saved. If not, the journey might claim them. Their path cut through thickets and over rocky terrain, each step a physical and mental challenge. Ethan's small legs struggled to keep pace, but he never complained, his determination mirroring Annie's fierce resolve. Jack, seasoned and steady, led the way, though his demeanor grew more solemn as they neared the outskirts of the forest. The unseen dangers. The forest was alive with sounds that set their nerves on edge, the distant snapping of branches, the occasional growl of unseen creatures, and the eerie stillness that followed. At one point, the group stumbled upon a pile of animal carcasses, their remains picked clean. Jack examined the scene, his face grim. Wolves, he muttered. We need to keep moving. Annie tightened her grip on Ethan's hand. The discovery was a stark reminder that nature itself could be as hostile as the disaster that had driven them here. Hours later, their fears materialized. A faint rustling grew louder until a pair of wolves emerged from the underbrush, their eyes glowing with hunger. Annie's heart raced as she instinctively stepped in front of Ethan. Jack grabbed a large branch, brandishing it like a weapon, Stay calm, he said, his voice steady. The wolves circled, their growls low and menacing. Annie's mind raced. The ranger station's map had warned of wildlife, but she hadn't expected to confront it so soon. Just as one wolf lunged, Jack swung his branch, striking the animal and sending it yelping into the woods. The second wolf hesitated before retreating, its piercing gaze lingering as if to warn them. The adrenaline left them shaken but alive. The highway comes into view. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, revealing the cracked pavement of the highway. Relief swept through Annie as the open space seemed to promise safety. However, the scene before them was anything but reassuring. Cars were scattered along the road, many overturned or burned out. Broken glass and debris littered the ground, and the skeletal remains of buildings loomed in the distance. The highway was a graveyard, a stark reminder of the disaster's reach. Jack approached a vehicle and peered inside. No bodies, he said, more to himself than the others. They must have tried to run. Ethan tugged at Annie's sleeve. Do you think anyone's still alive? I hope so, she replied, though her gut told her otherwise. A glimmer of hope. As they moved cautiously along the highway, they spotted a makeshift campsite near an overpass. The remnants of a fire pit, scattered belongings, and a handwritten sign that read, "Rescue Ahead," gave them a fleeting sense of hope. Looks recent, Jack observed. They could have gone to find help. The group rested briefly, eating sparingly from their supplies. Jack scanned the horizon with binoculars he'd found at the ranger station. There's smoke about 2 miles ahead. Could be a rescue team, or survivors. Annie's heart leaped. The idea of finding others, of sharing the burden of survival, reignited her determination. The desperate encounter. As they neared the source of the smoke, the group's cautious optimism turned to dread. A band of scavengers had taken over the area, their makeshift camp bristling with crude weapons and stolen goods. Stay low, Jack whispered, pulling them behind an abandoned car. They're not rescuers. Annie's mind raced. They needed to avoid detection, but the road offered little cover. Jack signaled for them to follow as he crept along the edge of the highway, keeping a wary eye on the scavengers. Suddenly Ethan tripped, the sound of his fall drawing the attention of one of the men. He shouted, alerting the others. Run! Jack barked, grabbing Ethan and bolting toward the woods. Annie followed, her heart pounding as the scavengers gave chase. Bullets ricocheted off nearby rocks and trees, their pursuers relentless. The trio plunged into the forest, zigzagging through the undergrowth to evade capture. After what felt like an eternity, the gunfire ceased, and the forest grew eerily silent. They collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath. Are you okay? Annie asked Ethan, checking him for injuries. I'm fine, he whispered, though tears streaked his face. Jack peered back toward the highway. They won't follow us in here, he said. Too risky for them. But we need to find another way to safety. The nightfall decision. As night fell, the group found refuge in an abandoned service station on the edge of the forest. The building was damaged but offered enough protection to let them rest. Jack barricaded the door, while Annie lit a small fire to keep them warm. The events of the day weighed heavily on them. Annie sat beside Ethan, who had finally drifted off to sleep. How much longer can we keep doing this? She asked Jack, her voice tinged with despair. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. As long as it takes, he said finally. We can't give up. Not now. The road ahead was uncertain, and the dangers they faced were mounting. But one thing was clear, their survival depended on their resilience and each other. As the fire crackled softly, Annie resolved to keep moving, no matter what challenges lay ahead. They had made it this far, and she refused to let their journey end here. Morning arrived with an uneasy stillness. Annie, Jack, and Ethan emerged from their temporary shelter, the remnants of their fire smoldering faintly. The scavengers were still a looming threat, but the promise of the distant smoke, a potential sign of rescue, was too strong to ignore. Every step toward it felt like a step closer to salvation or disaster. Jack unfolded the crumpled map one last time, his finger tracing a route that would take them through a stretch of open terrain and back to the highway. "If we move fast, we can make it before dark," he said. Annie nodded, steeling herself. "Then we don't stop." Crossing the gauntlet. The day's journey was grueling. The open terrain left them exposed, and the weight of exhaustion bore down heavily on each of them. Ethan struggled to keep up, his small frame no match for the relentless pace. But he refused to be carried, his determination shining through the fatigue. "Almost there," Annie murmured, though the words felt hollow. A sudden sound broke the silence, a low hum that grew louder with each passing second. Jack froze, signaling for the others to duck into a nearby ditch. A convoy of scavengers rumbled down the road in modified vehicles, their presence a stark reminder of how close danger remained. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered, gripping his makeshift weapon tightly. The group held their breath as the convoy passed, the roar of engines fading into the distance. Once the coast was clear, they resumed their march, their nerves frayed but their resolve unbroken. The final test. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the smoke's origin, a cluster of buildings surrounded by hastily constructed barriers. The sight of people moving within the compound sent a surge of hope through Annie. "We made it," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Jack wasn't as quick to celebrate. "We don't know who they are yet," he cautioned. "Stay behind me." As they approached the compound, a guard spotted them and raised his weapon. "Stop right there!" Jack raised his hands in surrender, stepping forward cautiously. "We're not here to fight," he said. "We need help." The guard hesitated, eyeing the group warily. Annie stepped forward, pulling Ethan close to her. "Please," she pleaded. "He's just a child. We've been running for days." The guard's gaze softened at the sight of Ethan. After a tense moment, he lowered his weapon and signaled for the gates to be opened. Safe, but at what cost? Inside the compound, the trio was met with a mix of relief and unease. The community was clearly organized, but its members bore the scars of a harsh existence. Supplies were rationed, and every face carried the weight of survival. A man who appeared to be the leader approached them. "I'm Marcus," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're safe here, but we don't have much to spare." Jack stepped forward. "We're not looking for charity. We can work." Marcus studied them for a moment before nodding. "Everyone pulls their weight. Rest tonight. We'll talk in the morning." A glimmer of hope. That night, as they huddled in a small corner of the compound, Annie felt the first flicker of safety since the disaster began. Ethan was asleep, his face peaceful for the first time in days. Jack sat nearby, sharpening a knife he'd been given. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said quietly. "I know," Annie replied. "But we've come this far. We'll figure out the rest." For the first time in days, they allowed themselves a moment of hope. The journey had tested their limits, but their survival was proof of their strength. As the compound settled into an uneasy quiet, Annie resolved to protect what they had found, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. Their story wasn't over, but for now, they had a chance to breathe, and that was enough.